In the forest outside Kisak, Slovakia, investigators stumbled upon something straight out of a nightmare. The decomposed bodies of two women, their remains mutilated and their final moments captured in gruesome photographs. The man responsible? A twisted cannibal who had planned every horrifying detail down to the last bite. Before we dive deeper into this chilling case, make sure to hit that subscribe button, comment your thoughts below, and share your theories on this shocking crime. On May 12, 2011, the quiet Slovak village of Kisak became the epicenter of one of Europe's most macabre criminal investigations. The man at the heart of this twisted story was 43-year-old Matej Curko, a computer technician whose quiet existence masked his dark, insidious desires. Curko's life of depravity came crashing down after a police sting operation, and the aftermath left authorities reeling as they uncovered the full scale of his horrific acts. Curko's grisly story began long before the police confrontation. His obsession with death, mutilation, and cannibalism started in the early 2000s, but it wasn't until 2009 that he began to actively seek out victims. The chilling nature of his crimes revealed a complex blend of consent and coercion. Victims who, in his own words, volunteered to die for him to satisfy his cannibalistic fantasies. One of the first known communications from Čurko was an email exchange with a man from Switzerland, Markus Dubach, who had reached out to him with the intent to be killed and eaten. But as the date for their meeting neared, Dubach had second thoughts. When he backed out, he contacted the authorities, and Čurko's online persona, Cannibalism, short for Cannibal Matej, was soon under investigation. The case took a deadly turn when Slovak police, using intelligence gathered through Dubach's testimony, set up an undercover operation to catch Čurko. Posing as Dubach, a police officer arranged to meet Čurko in the woods near Kisak on May 10, 2011. Armed and expecting to fulfill his darkest fantasies, Čurko arrived with knives, saws, and a body bag, planning to drug, kill, and dismember his victim. However, what Čurko didn't anticipate was the police ambush waiting for him. When Čurko pulled out a gun in an attempt to escape, police marksmen fired. The ensuing shootout left Čurko severely wounded, but he managed to injure one police officer before being brought down by 5 bullets. Čurko was rushed to the hospital, where he lingered in critical condition for 2 days before succumbing to his injuries on May 12, 2011. But that wasn't the end of the nightmare. As investigators sifted through Čurko's possessions, including his computer, they were horrified by what they found. The computer contained photographs of dismembered body parts, emails with his willing victims, and GPS coordinates that led to the discovery of shallow graves. Among the bodies found were those of 2 Slovak women, Lucia Uchnarova and Elena Gujakova, who had gone missing in 2010. Both had corresponded with Čurko online, agreeing to be killed and eaten. Their final moments were chillingly detailed in the emails, where they discussed the logistics of their own deaths. The most disturbing revelation, however, was Čurko's fridge of horrors. In his home, police found human remains, meticulously stored in a refrigerator. These remains, which included body parts that matched those found in the shallow graves, confirmed the cannibalistic nature of his crimes. The forensic evidence pointed to Čurko as a modern-day predator, someone who used the internet to lure victims, gain their consent, and then transform his violent fantasies into a grotesque reality. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Čurko's actions were far from isolated. His internet correspondence suggested that he had more victims, including women from Italy and other parts of Europe. The Italian police, alerted to the potential connection, began investigating dozens of missing women whose profiles matched those of Čurko's previous victims. Between 2009 and 2011, around 30 women disappeared in Italy, all fitting the same tragic pattern: young, vulnerable, and seemingly vanishing without a trace. Though Čurko's life ended in violence, the investigation into his crimes has continued to haunt law enforcement. Forensic experts and investigators have painstakingly compared DNA samples, examined photographs and emails, and tracked down every possible lead in the search for more victims. So far, it appears that Čurko's penchant for violence and cannibalism may have stretched far beyond Slovak borders, leaving a trail of death and terror across Europe. But the question remains, how did Curko manipulate his victims into consenting to their own murders? And what drove this seemingly average man to commit such horrific acts? Was it a deeply ingrained psychological disorder, or was it something more sinister? To answer these questions, we must delve deeper into the mind of a killer who saw death not as an end, but as a twisted form of intimacy, a final connection between him and his victims. Let us know what you think drove Curko to commit such unimaginable acts, and if you think there are other hidden victims yet to be uncovered. Matej Curko's path to infamy didn't just stem from the horrific acts he committed, but from his ability to blend into society and hide his dark urges behind a facade of normality. To understand how this man became the notorious Slovak Cannibal, we must first examine his background, psychological profile, and the steps that led him to commit such violent, calculated crimes. Born in 1968 in Slovakia, Curko seemed at first glance to be just another man living in a quiet Eastern European village. He was a computer technician, living in the small, rural village of Kisak, near the city of Košice. In fact, his life appeared remarkably ordinary, as he held a steady job and led a rather solitary existence. To those who knew him, Curko was an introverted, unremarkable man, with little in his behavior to suggest that he harbored a deadly obsession. His criminal tendencies, however, went back many years. While his first documented offenses were violent in nature, the full scope of his depravity only came into focus when investigators started sifting through his digital life. Curko's obsession with death and mutilation wasn't something that developed overnight. It had been simmering in his mind since his teenage years, when he even attempted suicide at 17. However, this wasn't a moment of despair that led him to abandon his life. It was just a sign of the chaos brewing inside him. Curko was already beginning to toy with death, fascinated by the idea of what it would mean to control another person's life. Around 2003, Curko started spending more time on the internet, which became the vehicle for his dark desires. In the early stages, he frequented dark web forums that discussed macabre subjects like cannibalism, fetishes, and other taboo practices. Here, he began meeting people who, much like him, were drawn to the extreme fringes of society's moral boundaries. Some of these online exchanges revolved around fantasies, but Curko soon took a step further, transitioning from talk to action. It was at this point that he started seeking out volunteers, individuals who were either suicidal or had a genuine interest in being killed and eaten. The consensual aspect of his crimes, while chilling in its own right, also added a layer of complexity to his personality and motivations. These weren't random victims snatched from the streets. Instead, Curko specifically targeted people who were vulnerable, those who, either due to emotional distress, depression, or curiosity, might be open to fulfilling his violent fantasies. The first victim to be fully identified in this sickening web was Lucia Ushnarova, a 25-year-old from the small town of Snina. Ushnarova had been missing since 2010, and her case had baffled local police for months. She was a woman who, like many others, had struggled with suicidal thoughts. She had reached out to Curko after seeing an online ad he had placed. Their communication soon shifted from the banal to the gruesome, as Curko convinced her that death would be a release, a final way to escape her pain. In their email exchanges, Curko assured Ushnarova that she would not be hurt or frightened, that her death would be swift and controlled. Yet, what he failed to mention was that her death would not be the end. The dark truth about his intentions would be revealed only when her dismembered body was discovered in the forest near Kisak, a shallow grave that lay under the forest canopy, hidden from the public eye. The second victim, Elena Gujakova, also had a history of depression and suicidal thoughts. Gujakova, like Ushnarova, had communicated with Curko and expressed an interest in ending her life. The two women were targeted during a period of intense psychological distress, a moment in their lives where the boundaries between fantasy and reality blurred. Their deaths were, in many ways, the culmination of Curko's predatory behavior. His online interactions with his victims were the key to his methodology. His dark persona, Cannibalism, became the vehicle through which he lured and manipulated those willing to meet him for an unspeakable end. Curko's use of the internet was not only a means to meet his victims, but a tool to exercise control and secrecy. The communications he maintained with these women were crucial. They formed the blueprint of his twisted psychological manipulation, and ultimately, they were the pieces of evidence that would bring him down. What is particularly chilling about Curko's case is the notion of consent. In his twisted logic, he believed that the act of volunteering to die somehow made his crimes more acceptable, less brutal. His victims, in his mind, were participants in a transaction, one that allowed him to indulge in his cannibalistic desires without resistance or recrimination. This dark idea of consent is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. It raises important questions about the limits of free will, the exploitation of vulnerability, and the role of mental illness in shaping such crimes. Was Curko simply a predator preying on the most fragile members of society? Or was he driven by something more psychological, a deep-seated need to dominate and control? The aftermath of Curko's crimes saw Slovak police not only grappling with the physical evidence left behind, body parts, photographs, and GPS coordinates, but also with the growing realization that the scale of his actions was likely much larger than initially suspected. The bodies of Uchnerova and Gujakova were just the tip of the iceberg. Police began to suspect that Curko may have had other victims, women who had vanished under mysterious circumstances, their fates sealed by the man they trusted. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Matej Curko's disturbing motivations and actions. Do you think his online communications were part of a larger pattern of exploitation? Or do you believe he truly believed in the idea of consensual death? In May 2011, the discovery of the bodies of Lucia Uchnerova and Elena Gujakova seemed to bring the hunt for Matej Curko to an unsettling climax. Yet the full extent of his crimes had yet to be uncovered. After police secured Curko's computer and analyzed the harrowing contents, they would begin to unravel the true scale of his depravity. One of the most shocking aspects of the investigation was the discovery of what has since been dubbed the Fridge of Horrors. During their search of Curko's home in Kisak, Slovak authorities found disturbing evidence that would confirm what many feared. Matej Curko had not only killed his victims, but had preserved parts of their bodies in an almost clinical manner, keeping them as trophies for his perverse desires. In the dimly lit kitchen of Curko's modest home, investigators stumbled upon a series of gruesome revelations. Inside his refrigerator, authorities found multiple body parts of his victims. Some were wrapped in plastic, others stored in jars. These human remains were carefully organized and cataloged, preserved in such a way that they could be consumed over time. There were limbs, pieces of flesh, and organs, all meticulously stored, a chilling reminder of Curko's cannibalistic urges. The very existence of the Fridge of Horrors raised immediate questions about Curko's state of mind. Was this a case of cold, premeditated violence, or had he been driven by an insatiable need to consume human flesh? Some experts speculated that his actions reflected the darkest aspects of human pathology, where the need for control and domination over another human being transformed into a grotesque obsession. As the investigation continued, they realized that the preservation of human remains was not only a way for Curko to fulfill his cannibalistic urges, but also a symbolic act. To him, keeping pieces of his victims was a way to exert power over them even after their deaths. Forensic scientists working on the case described the scene as a nightmare. These weren't just typical murder victims. They were part of a larger, sinister narrative of cannibalism that spoke to Curko's deep-rooted psychological disturbances. The police were able to match body parts found in the fridge with the remains discovered in the forest, further confirming Curko's role in their deaths. There was no doubt in their minds. Curko had indeed killed and eaten human flesh. As investigators delved deeper into Curko's personal life, they discovered that he had kept detailed records of his killings. His computer, which had been seized in the raid, contained photographs of the dismemberment process, along with chilling email exchanges between him and his victims. The sheer level of detail that Curko had gone into, from the selection of his victims to the meticulous documentation of each act, suggested that his crimes were far from impulsive. They were carefully planned, executed with precision, and disturbingly, part of a longer, ongoing cycle of violence. The fridge of horrors not only confirmed the brutal nature of Curko's actions, but also pointed to an unsettling truth. He had likely killed and consumed more victims than the police had initially discovered. One of the most unsettling pieces of evidence found in his home was a series of journals where Curko had documented his violent fantasies. These journals gave further insight into his sickening worldview. They revealed a man obsessed with the idea of death as an intimate, consuming act, one that could not be fully satisfied through the killing alone. The flesh of his victims was the final piece of a complex psychological puzzle that included both power and consumption. Curko's role as a computer technician played a pivotal part in his ability to remain undetected for so long. As an IT expert, he was capable of covering his tracks, using encryption and deleting evidence to hinder investigations. His ability to manipulate digital trails made it difficult for authorities to track his movements or uncover his full digital footprint. The evidence from his computer, however, was critical in bringing the case to light. It was through his online communications that investigators learned about his victims and his methods. Among the disturbing details was a set of coordinates that led authorities to the shallow graves of Ukhnarova and Gujakova. These GPS coordinates were stored on his computer, a piece of the puzzle that allowed investigators to locate the bodies. But the real shock came when forensic specialists analyzed the photographs and email exchanges on the computer. The images depicted the women, their lifeless bodies arranged in grotesque poses, with Curko's hands clearly visible as he manipulated the remains. These images didn't just confirm the women's fates, they offered a glimpse into the mind of a man who viewed death as an art form, an act of both destruction and creation. It was clear that the Fridge of Horrors wasn't just a storage facility for body parts, it was an integral part of Curko's ritual. Every time he opened that fridge, it reinforced his sense of dominance over his victims, who were now nothing more than objects to be consumed and discarded at his whim. But the deeper psychological implications of this act were perhaps the most chilling of all. This wasn't just about satisfying a hunger for flesh, it was about maintaining control over those he had killed. The very act of consuming his victims was a way for Curko to feel powerful, to prove that he had the final say over life and death. It was an unholy cycle that, tragically, seemed to give him a sense of satisfaction and fulfillment. The investigation into Matej Curko's gruesome activities was about to take a dramatic and violent turn in May 2011. As the authorities closed in on him, Curko's twisted plans would come face to face with law enforcement in a final bloody confrontation that would ultimately end his reign of terror. It was a standoff in the quiet village of Kisak, Slovakia, where Curko had lived, worked, and carried out his heinous crimes. By now, Slovak investigators had pieced together the shocking details of Curko's cannibalistic actions. They had uncovered his disturbing digital trail, including encrypted communications with potential victims from around the world, and more alarmingly, photographs of his murders. His carefully maintained online presence, where he identified himself as Cannibalism, an unmistakable reference to his cannibalistic urges, had allowed authorities to track his movements and identify possible future victims. But despite their mounting evidence, Curko remained elusive, hiding behind a veil of secrecy that made him nearly impossible to apprehend. One of the critical breakthroughs came when authorities intercepted an email communication between Curko and a man from Switzerland, later identified as Markus Dubach. Dubach had initially agreed to be killed and eaten by Curko, a shocking admission that sent ripples through international law enforcement. However, upon realizing that Curko was deadly serious, Dubach had a change of heart and contacted the police. Swiss authorities alerted Interpol, which in turn informed Slovak police of the situation. This revelation set in motion a high-risk operation that would culminate in a confrontation between Curko and law enforcement officers in the dense forests of Kisak. Authorities knew they had to act quickly. If Curko had already killed 2 women and was communicating with potential new victims, there was no telling how many more might be in danger. They also understood that capturing Curko alive could provide vital evidence for prosecutors, but at the same time, They knew how dangerous he was. Armed and prepared to kill, Curko had shown no hesitation in taking the life of those who fell into his perverse world. The Slovak police, under the direction of a specialized tactical unit, decided to implement an undercover sting operation. A police officer, posing as the Swiss man who had earlier communicated with Curko, was set to meet him at a secluded spot in the forest. This meeting had been arranged for the morning of May 10, 2011, and the officers involved were well aware of the risks they were taking. They were not only dealing with a man suspected of multiple murders, but one who had shown an affinity for violence and who had already demonstrated his readiness to kill. On that fateful day, Curko showed up at the agreed location in the woods just as planned. However, he was not there to meet a willing victim. Instead, he was about to encounter a heavily armed police force, ready to take him down. What followed was a deadly gunfight that would end with Curko's death and reveal the final chilling details of his crimes. The confrontation began when Curko, upon spotting the police officers, immediately pulled out a firearm and opened fire. He wounded one officer, striking him in the arm. However, the officers, who were stationed nearby and armed with high-powered sniper rifles, did not hesitate. They returned fire, striking Curko 5 times. Despite the severity of his injuries, Curko attempted to flee, but the officers continued their pursuit, determined not to let him escape. Eventually, he collapsed from the multiple gunshot wounds and was apprehended. Curko was rushed to the Louis Pasteur Hospital in Košice, where he was operated on by a team of surgeons. However, despite their best efforts, Curko's injuries were too severe, and he died of his wounds just 2 days later, on May 12, 2011. His death brought a sudden and violent end to a case that had captivated the world, but it also left many questions unanswered. While Curko had been physically neutralized, his mind, and the full extent of his depravity, went with him to the grave. In the aftermath of the shootout, Slovak police were left to piece together the remnants of Curko's horrific acts. They had secured critical evidence, including a number of weapons, knives, saws, and a body bag, which had been found at the crime scene. These items, along with the photographs and documents recovered from his home, would provide investigators with a clearer understanding of Curko's methods and motivations. However, there was one chilling question that remained: how many victims had Curko claimed over the years? Despite the confirmed deaths of Ushnarova and Gujakova, investigators suspected that the full extent of Curko's cannibalistic spree had yet to be uncovered. His online communications with victims, many of whom were never found, hinted at the possibility of even more deaths. In addition, the GPS coordinates found on his computer, linked to other locations in Slovakia and beyond, suggested that Curko had been operating across a wider area than originally thought. Was he truly working alone, or had he been helped by others? The investigators were left grappling with these questions, knowing that without Curko alive to provide answers, many of the details of his horrific acts would remain hidden. The death of Matej Curko, while bringing an end to his reign of terror, left a dark stain on the Slovak public consciousness. The brutality of his crimes, cannibalism, murder, and the exploitation of willing victims was a stark reminder of the potential for evil that can lie hidden in the most unlikely of places. As the world learned of the full scope of Curko's crimes, the chilling question lingered: how many others like him are out there waiting in the shadows? What are your thoughts on the final standoff with Curko? Do you believe that his death closed the case, or is there still more to be uncovered about his crimes? Let us know in the comments below. The death of Matej Curko in May 2011 brought an unsettling end to one of the most horrifying cases of modern cannibalism ever uncovered. While law enforcement had successfully neutralized the threat he posed, the legacy of his crimes continued to reverberate throughout Slovakia and beyond. The disturbing nature of his actions, paired with the unsettling idea that he had operated with others, left authorities and the public alike grappling with a series of unresolved questions. In the immediate aftermath of Curko's death, Slovak police scrambled to assess the full scale of his activities. The 2 confirmed victims, Lucia Uknarova and Elena Gujakova, were brutally murdered, with their bodies dismembered and disposed of in shallow graves. The authorities were still waiting for DNA tests to definitively confirm their identities, but the emerging evidence painted a grim picture of Curko's methodical and calculated approach to killing. He had not acted impulsively, but rather with a sense of eerie control, planning each step of his crimes with chilling precision. One of the most unsettling aspects of the investigation was the fact that his victims had willingly entered into these horrific transactions, fully aware of what was about to unfold. In his online correspondence with Uchnerova, Curko had made it clear that his victims' consent was a crucial part of his twisted fantasies. He had specifically sought out individuals who shared his perverse desires, people who were eager to die and, in some cases, be consumed. This added a layer of complexity to the case. Was Curko merely a product of his own mental illness, or was he a cunning manipulator who preyed on vulnerable individuals? In the weeks following his death, Slovak authorities continued to examine the electronic evidence found on Curko's computer, including the photographs, email exchanges, and the chilling GPS coordinates that led them to the bodies of his victims. This material provided significant insight into Curko's mindset, revealing his disturbing fantasies and the lengths he had gone to in order to satisfy them. Yet, for every piece of evidence they uncovered, new questions arose. One of the key pieces of evidence was the discovery of a ceremonial altar in the woods near Kaisak, a location where Curko had carried out many of his killings. The altar, which appeared to be a deliberately constructed site for rituals, suggested that Curko had not only been motivated by cannibalistic urges, but possibly by a twisted sense of ritualistic importance. Was he attempting to reenact a particular form of ritualistic sacrifice, or was this merely a further expression of his perverse desires? This altar added an unsettling religious dimension to his crimes, one that authorities could not easily explain away. Despite the massive amount of evidence, many questions about Curko's methods and motivations remained unanswered. Was Curko truly acting alone, or was there a network of like-minded individuals who helped him find and perhaps manipulate his victims? Some experts suggested that Curko could have had accomplices, people who either helped him find victims or assisted with the disposal of bodies. However, no evidence surfaced to confirm this, leaving the theory as one of many dark possibilities. Another troubling aspect of the case was the suggestion that Curko may have been involved in an even larger network of people who shared his cannibalistic fantasies. During the investigation, authorities uncovered evidence that Curko had communicated with potential victims from outside Slovakia, including those from Switzerland and Italy. His online activities, combined with the GPS coordinates found on his computer, suggested that Curko had traveled to different locations in Europe, possibly in search of new victims. Could there have been others out there, living with the same dark desires? And if so, was Curko a part of something even more sinister than initially suspected? As authorities continued to sift through the remaining evidence, the fear of a possible cannibalistic subculture, or even a global network of individuals with similar predilections, began to take root. The media coverage surrounding the Curko case only added fuel to these speculations, as every new detail seemed to open up further, darker questions. Was Curko a lone wolf, or was he part of a growing underground movement that sought to fulfill the same twisted needs? The police investigation also uncovered disturbing evidence about the psychological profile of Curko himself. Although he had always denied any sexual motivation behind his acts, many experts believe that his cannibalism was intertwined with sexual fetishes, making his crimes even more grotesque. He had reportedly stated that he wanted to experience the death of another in a visceral, physical way, and that eating his victims was a key part of fulfilling that desire. Experts believe that his act of cannibalism was not just about satiating hunger, but about creating a deeply intimate and disturbing connection with the life force of his victims. Forensic psychologists and criminal profilers who analyzed Curko's case pointed out that his behavior displayed classic signs of a serial killer with a need for dominance and control. The calculated nature of his actions, his search for willing victims, and his detailed plans all pointed to a person who thrived on manipulation and power over others. It became increasingly clear that Curko's death had not brought closure to the case, but instead had revealed deeper psychological layers that needed to be understood in order to prevent future tragedies. In the public sphere, Curko's case had a lasting impact, not only on Slovak society, but on international perceptions of the dangers of online anonymity. The fact that Curko had been able to lure victims from different countries by using the internet as his primary means of communication was a wake-up call to many law enforcement agencies. His case prompted calls for better monitoring of online platforms, especially those that allowed individuals to engage in criminal or dangerous activities anonymously. The ease with which Curko had found willing participants for his gruesome fantasies underscored the growing threat of internet-facilitated crimes that crossed international borders. In the end, the questions surrounding Matej Curko's cannibalistic crimes remain unanswered. While his death closed the chapter on one of Slovakia's darkest chapters in recent memory, it opened up new avenues for criminal investigation and forensic science. What motivated Curko? How many victims did he truly have? And most chilling of all, how many more people like him may be lurking in the shadows, seeking to fulfill their own horrific desires? What do you think about the psychological profile of Matej Curko? Do you believe that his acts of cannibalism were purely driven by a twisted desire for control? Or was there something more behind his gruesome fantasies? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more in-depth true crime stories.